Oh, I'm so glad to welcome you, Matt and Am. I'll introduce you briefly. I also wanted to welcome those of you who are joining virtually and those of you who have joined the classroom. Just to begin, as teachers and students on a settler educational institution operating on the traditional territories of many nations, including the Anishinaabeg, Lenape, and Haudenosaunee and Chinantan confederacies, we acknowledge that the colonial education system created residential schools in an attempt to erase and eliminate First Nations communities. We commit to providing education that consistently models and practices right relations, which Matt and help us think through what those right relations might look like in terms of love and friendship. We commit to accountability to the broken treaties and care for the land that nourishes and teaches us the path to decolonize futures. Matt Hern and Johal are the co-authors of two books that are united by their common search for these futures. For forms of community that surpass the logics of domination and exploitation that define the nation state. Today, we are invited to join their search, guided by a question that has never felt more urgent or daunting. How can we learn to be together? In 2018, Am and Matt published Global Warming and the Sweetness of Life, which is a kind of travel log of their road trips to the tar sands of northern Alberta. And their most recent book, Oh My Friends, There Is No Friend, The Politics of Friendship at the End of Ecology, was released by Transcript Publishing in an open access format last year. And I think I had this right. The website now says that it will be coming to bookstores near us in April. Is that the date you know? Do you know?
Yeah, it keeps changing. It's February. February it was available through Columbia University Press, but it should be around in April. That's right.
Okay. My bookstore said I had to wait till April. Um, uh, so just a few words by way of framing what sets these books apart from so many theoretical studies. They offer hands-on methods of gathering and testing models of ecology, sociality, and solidarity. When they are not meeting up each Sunday to think and write and eat and drink together at the Portuguese Club in downtown Vancouver, Am and Matt can be found putting these collaborative models to practical work, helping to forge variously supportive communities across the lower mainland of BC. Matt is co-founder and co-director of Solid State Community Industries, an economic development agency building solidarity economies and worker co-ops focused on racialized and immigrant communities in Surrey. And my second page is recovered. Since 2010, Am served as the director of the Van City Office of Community Engagement at Simon Fraser University, where he bridged campus and wider publics through civic and cultural partnerships, and dynamic public programming focused on arts and culture, social and environmental justice. I really recommend, if you haven't already, to work through the vast and rich archive of Under the Radar, the podcast that hosted for many years. Under Am's leadership, the office has provided an extraordinarily inspiring model for community-engaged arts and humanities research and education. So SFU's recent decision to shutter the program feels especially dire. This loss impels us to reckon with the role that educational organizations must and too often fail to play in the urgent project of cultivating the kind of togetherness that underwrites what Am and Matt describe and practice as a politics of friendship. So thank you both for gathering us together today. Sorry to have my back to you through all of this. And for gathering us today around your powerful incitements to live towards a shared ecological future together. So I will, this is not going to be a talk. This is going to be a conversation, as much as seamless a conversation as the technology and the hybrid format will allow. But I would love to have you introduce yourselves in whatever way feels right and talk a little bit about the books that are anchoring our conversation.
Yep. Go ahead, Matt.
Well, thank you for that. Thanks for that kind introduction. Appreciate y'all. appreciate everybody who's here in person and online. Thanks a lot for coming today. We're going to try I think that's true. We're going to try to make this as much of a conversation as possible. It's a little tricky in this hybrid environment, given Am and I's advanced age and technological, generating capacities. We're going to do what we can do here. Um, but I think, generally speaking, we're just going to try to chat for a while. We're going to describe um, what we're up to as a project. We're going to talk a little bit about that sweetness book, for sure. And then we're going to talk, I think, more. We want to talk about the old Friends book. And I think we're just going to go for a while until it feels like maybe we need a break for 5 minutes. And then we're hoping that you guys will help us with some questions. But we also have some questions for you too. And if we were in person, we would probably do something a little bit more participatory and get folks to talk to each other. But that seems a little extra complicated right now. But I would encourage you as we're going, because questions, yes. Comments of your own, critiques, generalize, all of them are super welcome. So let's have a run at it and see what we can do. The first thing I'll do, and then maybe I'll turn it over to you, Johal, is just say a little bit about our territorial acknowledgements here. I normally I live on the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam people, and I live on Musqueam waters. I live on a houseboat at the mouth of the Fraser River, just outside of Vancouver. But I'm actually right now. I'm in Princeton, New Jersey right now, which is the traditional territories of the Lenni Lenape people. And I appreciate the land acknowledgement you guys offered at the beginning there, and I'm sure you've heard plenty. And those are complicated things to do in lots of ways, because they're fraught with complications. They're fraught with colonial notions of territoriality. They're fraught with some sort of inaction or some kind of gestural or performative affect. And so, but I think they're still really important to do and to think about it. And every time we acknowledge territory, we're trying to think about something else, about not just putting that aside as like, oh yeah, we're just saying that, now we can get on to the real thing. But to keep kind of bearing that in mind, because in some ways, just trying to follow through on territorial acknowledgements to say, well, all right, we're acknowledging territory, so what? Is in large respect one of the questions right at the heart of these two books. So I want to just kind of leave that, my own territorial acknowledgement there, acknowledge its inadequacies, and acknowledge that it's something that I think is both required, but it needs a lot more thinking, a lot more work. So I want to try to see if I can return to that somewhere back in a way, and see if we can think about what that might mean. Emma, you want to follow up with that?
Yep. Great to be here, and thank you for the invitation, Ruth and Kate. Wonderful to be in conversation with you over the next couple of hours. I'm usually based in Vancouver as well, on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories. I'm currently right now in the basement of my parents' house because they're both going through health challenges. My mother broke her ankle, has a couple of pins in it. My father had a 3-month bout of pneumonia last year, and he just got one again, has been in the hospital the last 8 days. So I'll be going to pick him up from the hospital later on this evening. Feels very infantilizing being in your parents' house. My father was a lumber grader and worked there. My mother cleaned hotel rooms. So coming from a working class background, this is the traditional territories of the Shawakam people here in Williams Lake in the interior of BC. My parents are immigrants. Their families came from what is today Pakistan, but with the colonial partition, they're Punjabi Sikh. The families moved to the Indian side. My father was born before partition, my mother after. And the story of their arrival into Canada, my father was 19 years old in the 60s. My mother came in the early 70s, is related to the family's loss of land, loss of economy, related to the partition of India and Pakistan. And so that if we look deep enough into our own family stories, we have some sort of connection to the colonial and historically in whatever way that lands down, and we're shaped in the present so much by it as well. And so in these books, and I hope we get into the discussion today as well, is that these are not just historical conversations. We're talking about presents and futures as well when we talk about colonialism and the importance of doing these land acknowledgements in Vancouver, where we're based, because there weren't treaties that were signed. There's modern day land claims processes underway. There's legal cases underway, and there's also urban development underway that's happening in the present. But really look forward to the conversation today, and I'll pass it back to Ruth.
Me. So the way that we laid things out, that you we'll talk a little bit about an introduction to the two books, how we how we find you here, your process, the ways that they're connected, and how they relate to the title of the talk, how we can be together. I can also prompt that conversation with some questions, but
No, we're good. We're good.
Yeah.
Well, we can speak to that a little bit. Just and that the connections, and one of the things you may have noticed, and I don't know if you caught that in our bios, but neither Am nor I are traditional academics. We both got PhDs, but honestly don't use them all that much in our professional lives. And so Am works in community engagement at SFU, as you heard, and I run this thing called Solid State Community Industries. And we started work as co-ops out in Surrey with racialized migrant populations. And we don't have day-to-day access to a lot of conferences, a lot of academic discourses. We circulate around academics. I'm currently, speaking of infantilizing, I'm currently in the corner of my daughter's apartment at Princeton University here. So we're circling around academic discourses and are certainly interested, but it also, we have to kind of make our own way sometimes. And a lot of that means talking to friends. That means bugging people who are really theoretically engaged. That means thinking together and thinking in maybe some non-traditional ways. And for many years now, Am and I have had the practice of meeting every Sunday afternoon. One of the things that happens as you get older is sometimes some of your friendships start slipping away, and people's family commitments and other kind of commitments start taking over. And so, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, I guess Am and I made the practice of saying, nah, we're just going to meet every Sunday at 1 o'clock. And we are going to be at the Portuguese Club, and anybody and any of our friends are invited. And so people know where we are on Sunday afternoons. They want to come and hang out. And sometimes it's a lot of people, and sometimes it's just the two of us. But we've made a practice of, just kind of chit-chatting and talking shit to each other and, thinking about sports mostly. But at least to some regard, and certainly around these two books, we've made a practice of trying to read together. And a lot of the generative thinking behind these two books are Am and I trying to turn over big questions in our heads together in a non-traditional way. Sometimes we're reading books together. Sometimes we're thinking about these ideas together. And oftentimes lots of our friends are coming in and chipping in on that. Sometimes it's just a conversation between the two of us. And oftentimes it looks something like a seminar. And oftentimes it means us taking on complicated books that we are too scared to read by ourselves, that we want to read together and see if we understood them correctly. So that is our practice. And that's how both of these books have emerged. And we'll talk a little bit first about sweetness, but it's a really complicated time to be asking these kind of questions. And I think we need to be upfront about how cautious we have been and how cautious we are about descending into certain kinds of insipidness. Writing two books that have one, friendship, and two, sweetness in the title might suggest a certain kind of saccharine, can't we all be together? Can't we be all friends kind of analysis? And I hope that neither book evinces that particularly, but we're trying to renovate ideas like the sweetness of life and the ideas of friendship in a political moment that is in particularly fraught, certainly ruptured by ongoing colonialisms and land dispossessions, certainly in Canada and elsewhere, but also this particular issue that Friends was instigated by, this idea of borderlessness and the ongoing violence of borders that is, of course, a part of all of our everyday lives forever, but certainly with renewed intensity over the last couple of months in a Canadian context. But this issue of borderlessness and of movement and of who belongs where, these tie up together with this notion about how to be together. How do we be together in a human context, but also extended through to an ecological context, which is to say, how can we be together with other humans, but also the other than human world? And so those questions are swirling around these two books in a variety of ways. And much of our attempt here is to think past, yes, the ethno-nationalisms and the border violences that are marking our world today, but also the pressing catastrophes of ecological crises. And we might suggest to you that the connective tissue between those two kinds of questions of nationalism and questions of ecology, are something like the title of this lecture or this talk of how can we be together? And we might suggest that the failures of ecology and the failures of nationalism are both failures to address the question of how to be together with any kind of longevity and any kind of dignified and respectful response. That's the introduction, and what I'm going to try to tie those two books together. We're going to try to think of these two books as essentially one long exploration together. But Ben, why don't you pick it up from there for me?
Sure. One of the things, I think we want to also talk about the writing process a little bit as a project as well, just to share that with you because you're all involved in creative projects as well. When we were starting global warming and the sweetness of life, at least I was involved in a community coalition related to the 2010 Olympics up to 2010. And there was a period there where it was sort of the exhaustions and closures of political moments. And I decided to work on a dissertation. I went to a very obscure place called European Graduate School, which, I call it PhD summer camp, but I had a chance to, sit with philosophers and theorists. And ended up doing a dissertation around the work of Alain Badiou, who's a French philosopher. He comes out of the militant political tradition from the 60s, particularly May 1968, but he hadn't written very much on climate change. I encountered him when he was in his 80s and was a kind of jolly old Maoist as opposed to a very dour one by that point. And the idea was to think about his ideas of militant political change alongside the climate emergency. And coming out of that process, Matt gets a lot of crazy ideas as we sit and meet every week. But one of his ideas was to go to the tar sands of Alberta because his stepdaughter had taken up a job there to save money to go to nursing school. And, and Joe Sacco had come up to SFU for a few events, so we knew him a little bit. And he was working on his book, Paying the Land at the time, which came out just a few years ago. And so he was interested in questions of extraction and development. And it was a really, I think, an interesting opportunity. Of course, these projects, when they start off, it's like, okay, we're going to do a few trips. We're going to pull this little travelogue together in 6 months. But of course, it took more like about 3 years or so to get it submitted. These things take on a life of their own. I think the other piece I would say is that, we, as Matt said, we're sort of on the edges and periphery of the academy in many ways, even though we teach and we write in these pieces. And so, taking up philosophy and theory for me later in life, although I was always interested in it, was, how can we write in a rigorous way, but at the same time, in a way that's understandable for a broader public. And so even though it's with MIT Press and academic press, it came out as a trade book. And we hope that, as a travelogue, that it was a way of writing about theory and philosophy in a more accessible way, that we could unpack this work in a different kind of way. One of the things I'll just mention before passing back to Matt as well is that we talk a little bit about this concept of sumak kase and buen vivar, which I think are important pieces as well. It's oftentimes translated as good living or well living, but it's not a kind of like Western notion of individual wellness. Eduardo Gudinas, a leading scholar on this subject, that the translations don't fully capture the meaning. It comes from the Quechua language. Sumac refers to the ideal and beautiful fulfillment of the planet. Kase means life, a life with dignity, plenitude, balance, and sort of the characteristics and aspect of these pieces, that there's no life without knowledge or wisdom. We come from the earth. Life is healthy, life is collective. We have aspirations or dreams, notions of balance that they try to articulate as it relates to development of feeling well, thinking well, doing well, notions of relationality, reciprocity, connection. There's an interculturality built into it, a plurinationality about it, a questioning of national approaches to development, and that it's not just a philosophy, but a way of life that promotes balance, community well-being, and understanding and applying its principles can help rethink development. And also this notion that it's an unfinished decolonial social proposal, constantly being refined in the context and localities that it's attempting to come to be. And looking at these notions, I think, opened up ways for us to think through this. And I think what you'll find in both books is that we're not ending the book with a political proposal or a program, but it was a way for us to think together questions that were befuddling us, challenging us, and also that we continue to grapple with in the ways that we have not come to terms with the ecological emergency. And I think, Matt's right in saying that these books do work together. In some way, they're a sequel, although not obviously so. And in speaking with in the second book with Jean-Luc Nancy, who was close to near the end of his life when we interviewed him, it was really interesting, hearing somebody who for 50 years or so had been writing about friendship and community in different ways. And he was still, a few months before passing away, asking the question, like, we have not yet solved the problem of how to be together. And to us, that was a chilling commentary. And when we go through the beginnings of philosophy, even the word philosophy has the word friendship inside of it in its etymology. So people have been thinking through this for a very long time. Matt, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Yeah, and forgive me, I probably should know this, but I'm not sure how much or what parts of that Sweetness book you were assigned to read or happened to read. But the genesis of it really, in a lot of ways, and you guys are all familiar with this, with the kind of the particular place that Fort McMurray holds in the kind of Canadian consciousness. For lots of folks, it's this kind of mortar. It's this center of ecological degradation. It kind of holds this iconic place of everything that's wrong with the world. This is the place that is destroying the planet willfully. But for whole other swaths of folks, it's a particular locus of opportunity. People from all over the world, and certainly from all over Canada, and maybe some of you all, or some of your friends, or some of your family, have gone there because it's a place of unbelievable opportunity for folks to make money that they would not have the opportunity to make anywhere else. A place to turn their lives around, a chance to imagine new futures for themselves. And the genesis of this book was exactly that, which is that one of my kids, she'd spent kind of most of her 20s working in bars, working in restaurants, kind of not real sure what she wanted to do. Um, and I think by the time she was about 27 or something like that, she was like, she knew she needed to try something else. And she decided to go to work in Fort Mac. This was in, I don't know, 2015 or 2016, somewhere in that zone. Um, and one of the things that was weird, and um, kind of tough for me, and honestly, is that she didn't tell me until right before she left. Um, and I had been, partially that's for lots of reasons. Maybe because as her parent, I was, worried about going to Fort Mac as a single woman. But I think more than that, she was maybe a little bit ashamed. Um, uh, I've been involved in ecological organizing for a long time, and the idea of going to Fort Mac sounds like you're doing something dirty, you're doing something wrong. And I felt terrible, that she didn't want to tell me, but it was kind of like a real insight because this was like in the mid 2000s, like I think it was 2015 she went, but she went and uh, she worked at a flying camp at the front desk, and the flying camp was like it was a dry camp for number one, but people would just come in every once in a while. She'd hand in the keys, show them where her room was, and that's about it. Say cafeteria's down the hall, your room's that way, and she just had massive amounts of free time, and so she was paid. She was paid back then. She was paid $35 an hour for 35 hours a week, and then time and a half for the other 35 hours a week. So she was working 70 hours a week and really didn't have all that much to do. She had a tremendous amount of time to think about her future, and the footnote is that it actually worked. She ended up working up there for about 6 months and then making enough money to go to nursing school, and now she teaches nursing and is a full-time nurse and nursing instructor. But that little incident there, right? And I suspect that some of you might have had something like that or have circumstances similar to that, is that there's one place this becomes this locus of these kinds of conversations about just so full of opportunity, but so full of of opprobrium as well. And so Am and I got interested in that is that particular rupture. And we see that in all kinds of discourses, but that inability of environmentalist and ecological movements to speak to all kinds of folks, in particular working class populations, because in our mind, ecological discourses are often framed in notions of discipline and shame and all kinds of languages that are really hard for lots of people to hear. But it also offered us an opportunity, which is to say that we could go to Fort Mac, and my kid and a bunch of her friends were actually up there. They were working in bars, they were working in camps, so we had people to meet. We had people to stay with. We had people to hang around with. So me and them and Joe went up there. We ended up going there about 4 times, I think, or 5 times. I ended up going in total. And it provided this particular opportunity to ask those questions, to say what are some of those failures and some of those ruptures, and what are some of the ways that ecological discourses can think beyond that kind of that disciplinary mode and can think more broadly. And one of the things that we ended up finding, I'll leave it a little bit, except to say, and this is one of the connective pieces here, is that one of the things we started with is the suggestion that ecological domination, that is to say, the domination of the natural world by humans, is inextricably tied to and given permission by the domination of humans by other humans. That is to say that those two forms of domination of humans and the domination of the natural world, are tied together. And that to think one necessarily is to think the other. And thus, one of the notions that we came to, that we started with, but were certainly concretized by our visits. And we spent a lot of time in Janvier, which is an indigenous community just south of Fort Mac. And we spent a lot of time with indigenous activists, both across northern Alberta and in Fort Mac, was that you just cannot have an ecology built on domination. And that to think through ecology, the correct starting point is to think through colonial dispossession and domination, that those two things necessarily have to be tied together. And thus, that's where we came to this idea of the sweetness of being, the sweetness of living that cannot be built on a kind of domination. And so to try to dislodge those kinds of dominations are inextricably bound together. And that was the notion of this, is to suggest that we cannot then have an ecology without thinking through social relations, and primarily colonial social relations. And that's the correct starting point for thinking through a place like Fort Mac. Joel, you want to take it from there, bro?
I'll just add a couple of pieces around our process of working in the book. Joe Sacco, who's the graphic journalist that did the chapter, he only came on the first trip with us, but it's amazing watching an artist like him work. He just sits quietly. You don't know exactly what he's working on, and this ended up actually first being shown in a Swiss magazine. And when he sent us the comic that's in the chapter, we had no idea what he was going to do. He was kind of free to write it and do it as he wished, but he really sort of captured some of the big questions that came up. And in many respects, a lot of people grab the book, and that's the piece they see. They don't even bother reading the book because it actually captures it very succinctly and in a beautiful way.
What are you talking about, man? That's the part everybody read. Everybody else skimmed the rest of it. Reads the
Yeah.
cartoon. Come
Yeah,
on now.
that's what the and also the photographs that are in it, which are the large scale aerial photographs, are by somebody named Louis Helbig, who grew up in the same town as me, who worked in rural economic development. He picked up a very expensive habit of buying an old airplane and flying over pieces where there's ecological distress. He later on moved to Australia because his partner got a job at a university. He was doing similar things with the Great Barrier Reef as well. And so those were just other ways of telling the broader story of the scale that was happening. And I think for me, growing up in a working class town like Williams Lake, which is a forestry town, a lot of what I saw in Fort McMurray reminded me of any other kind of working class industry town, but it's just the sheer scale and size of it. I think the other piece that we were surprised by, or didn't necessarily see it in the other literature, or the kind of hit pieces that come out of Fort McMurray, how incredibly multicultural it is. People are going up there for economic opportunity, but huge population of African immigrants, a huge South Asian population, huge Filipino population, and so for a rural place in northern Canada, it's much more culturally diverse than many other places. And so there's also all those aspects of community building that were kind of interesting and positive, and all of those kinds of things. At the same time, in the 80s and early 90s, we had environmental movements coming to towns that I grew up in, like Williams Lake, and they were largely viewed as urban environmental organizers, and people felt that they weren't part of the discussion around the need to work and all of those kind of economic contradictions that come up in any kind of development context. And so this question also of how do we overcome the very kind of real economic choices that people have to make on a day-to-day basis to get by, and at the same time think about ecological emergency and think about all of these places. And as Matt said, this question of the human domination or other humans in a capitalist sense is something that we zoned in on, that if we are going to get to some sort of ecological present or ecological future, we need to think through that question of domination, not just domination of humans over humans, but humans over the more than human world as well. And we take that up in All My Friends as well. And I guess the other tie-in, of course, we have an interview with Leanne Simpson in both books, Glenn Coulthard as well. And by utilizing some of those interviews as well, it was another way of diving into that story and to think about it in a more of a global sense. We had the specificity of Fort McMurray, but in looking at some of the ideas and thinking coming out of South America, other parts of the world, that there ends up being a lot of commonality of what people are struggling with on the ground. And that very real notion that if you are going to be pushing for environmental change or policy change, support of Indigenous movements who are doing that work on the ground is actually one of the most practical ways of doing it, because on the front lines of those who are challenging extraction, who are challenging environmental destruction, Indigenous groups globally are on the front lines of many of those challenges and forms of dissent that are happening. Matt?
Yeah. Now that you're saying it, it's I hope that maybe they said all the different routes that we were turning those kind of questions, those kind of everyday questions that we talk about. Now that you say it, I can think about all the different ways. Yeah, calling like friends of ours like Glenn and Leanne, and asking Lou to take pictures, and talking to Joe, and thinking about it from as many different directions and ways, and hopefully the books could like see, they at least give you an idea of how we were turning those questions over. Yeah, in an everyday sense, but also in like a actually trying to think this through theoretically sense. And that's really the genesis of the Friends book too, right? Which is like sitting around and thinking about like thinking about stories like watching Greek citizens run down to the beaches to chuck stones at starving, boats of starving refugees. Um, to think through like people lining up in Hungary to kick at families from Syria trying to cross the border looking for safety. To think through, whole stadiums of people chanting like "Build the wall, throw them out," and all those renditions of that kind of virulent ethno-nationalism that are disfiguring everyday discourses, and of course now with ever renewed kind of velocity. Um, just how do we think about that, and how do we speak to that? What are some ways that we could like? How do you even wrap your mind around probably decent, otherwise like human kind people, like in southern Italy, literally chucking rocks at immigrants that are just trying to save themselves by crossing the Mediterranean from deprivation. Um, and then being able to justify that as somehow protective of something. Um, and that's the first, the kind of the basic questions that stimulated the old Friends book. And the start of that is that, well, that nationalism seems to be proving itself on a everyday basis, both on like gigantic scales, but also on very micro scales, as an inept way to define community. And when I say the word community, we're talking about community as in the broadest sense, not in the parochial sense, but in the broadest sense of how can we be together with others. That the rise of ethno-nationalism is really just an ongoing repetition of the ethics of borders and this fantasy of a unitary state. And we drove that we first started thinking about that. We drew those questions together to think through this question of nationalism, and the question of ecology are again have the same root cause, an inability to be together with others. And we tried to think through, and we identify ourselves mostly as anti-capitalist and and on the left, and to answer the question of like, well, like, what do you say? What do you say to those Greek citizens or those Italians who are, pushing refugee boats back into the sea? How do we respond to that without, succumbing to kind of cheap global village cliches? How can we think through and reimagine ways of being together beyond neo-colonial reordering? And those questions are thrown into all kinds of disarray by ecological crises that care nothing for borders. Global warming, species collapse, extinctions, pandemics. Those crises are entwined by like these viral isolationisms and necropolitics. So all of those questions, they're bound together in kind of increasingly complex and entwined ways. But the root of that Friends book is just that simple question of like, what are we supposed to think? What can we say to people? Um, Possibly people who are our friends, people in our family, people who are our neighbors, who will say like super, virulent anti-migrant. Will articulate a super anti-migrant policy. Will articulate an ethno-nationalism. Articulate even a white nationalist, explicitly or implicitly, sensibility. How can we talk about that in new ways? Um, Take it from there for a minute, will you?
Yep. Um, what one of the things that we talk about in the book in a broad kind of way is, what might a borderless solidarity look like between and amongst humans, but also with the more than human. And as we went to pull apart those questions, as we start off the book, we mentioned, there were these debates in the theory and philosophical arena amongst a group of people in the 80s that included Giorgio Agamben, his book Coming Community, Jean-Luc Nancy's book, The Inoperative Community, another one by Maurice Blanchot, The Unavowable Community, and a number of others. And it sort of, dissipated around the early 90s. Derrida wrote a book afterwards, getting into these questions, both around friendship and community. Our interest wasn't so much into jumping into that debate, but to think about the questions that people were trying to unpack in the context of how do we go back to think through friendship and community in light of the ecological emergency and in light of the forms of populist nationalism, populist authoritarianism that's coming to fruition now, accelerated by global scale computation, other technological means. That how do we think through some of those questions today? Because in many ways, the world has changed, we've changed. And so that was kind of our attempt at that intervention in light of those questions. As I mentioned, we interviewed Leanne Simpson again, Jean-Luc Nancy. I mentioned the other person we found just through our reading was Leela Gandhi. And one of the things you'll find as you start to research these questions is we were sort of, about 2/3 of the way through or close to finishing a rough draft of the book. And we came across Leela Gandhi's book, Affective Communities, which she wrote in 2006. And she basically said what we wanted to say, wrote it in a much more beautiful way than we could have. And she did it way back in 2006. And so it actually threw us off quite a bit. It was like, we thought we were covering new terrain, but here she had already basically done it back in 2006. Her means and approach was to kind of look at the broader colonial question, but she was looking at utopian movements in the late 19th century where people from India, other colonized places were going to university in England, who were coinciding with vegetarian movements, queer movements, and others, and attempting a different type of way of being in the world, which eventually these had connections to decolonial movements that had real life political force later on. And so this is, I think, another sort of thing we'd want to share with you is that as you do your own writing and you begin to do research, you'll find that people have already done this work before you in an interesting way. So we had to, figure out how to bring that together. There's a couple of other people I would mention as well that we learned a lot from. Only small parts of it made it into the book, but Julietta Singh's work around rethinking mastery, a real wonderful book, a really beautiful person. And Matt and I were just in her class last month, continuing the conversation. Another person, Jasbir Puar, who was at Rutgers and is now at UBC, wrote a book called Terrorist Assemblages, and another couple of books. But she has interviews online where she's talking about queer nationalism and homo nationalism, and she's sort of reusing the term nationalism in a way that it crosses borders, that has a political expression about invoking these terms or reusing them in a different way that I think has a relationship to the borderlessness that we talk about in the work. And having her in Vancouver has been really great to be in conversation with her as well. And when we start to talk about borders, it's an interesting time, not to sidetrack what we're talking about, but in this context of, tariff wars and these types of things, when we talk about borderlessness in this broad and philosophical sense, sometimes a border is also where freedom or a kind of distance can happen as well, in a time when, one could make an argument that in a very distorted, hyper aggressive way, Donald Trump is pushing for a kind of borderlessness, wanting to erase the Canadian border and all of these things. But that's not what we're talking about in the book. Our idea of borderlessness is a very different argument that we're making. And one of the people that we went deep into in this work is Achille Mbembe, originally from Cameroon, teaches in South Africa, and he's talking about borderlessness or the planetary in a broad sense as a collective inheritance, and that the right to move in a decolonial sense is something that's existed from the beginning of time, and also that the right to move should not be based around the accident of one's passport, that wherever one is born, if you're born in Nigeria, if you're born in Nepal, if you're born in Canada, that the right to move through these regulatory structures is discriminatory in this basis. And of course, he's talking about freedom of movement within the African continent, but also in terms of imagining perishability and the right to move as a part of maintaining one's existence. And so the bordering of Europe and all of these things become into large questions. He has he's known for books, Critique of Black Reason, Necropolitics, and others. But there's a book of his that's an obscure one that's not as widely known. It's called The Earthly Community, and it was published with an art organization in Rotterdam, where he's talking about the planetary in this sense. There's a lot of interviews with him online as well. I had a chance to study with him at European Graduate School a couple of times online and once in person. But I think the work that he's doing and the thinking he's doing around this is particularly relevant in the present political moment. Matt?
Yeah. Let's just take Joel, let's just take a little bit, and then when we open it up for a few questions and for some commentary after this. But when we're talking, some of this stuff and some of our work, to be frank, is pretty dense theoretically. We kind of get into the weeds sometimes. Where, as Anne mentioned, we are definitely trying to speak in a more accessible way. But some of those ideas, and certainly for us, and maybe for you, are often pretty complicated and take a minute just to kind of parse out. But a theory's got a particular value to it, I might suggest to you. A theory is just an explanatory framework, just trying to answer what the hell's going on. And these are to try to be able to move back and forth and to be able to deploy certain kinds of theoretical mechanisms. I think is really useful, especially if we can think about it in the present moment, because it's a particularly volatile moment in all kinds of ways. I mentioned that I'm just outside of New York City right now, and I left for Vancouver. I don't know, from Vancouver about a week ago or something, and I was a bit chagrined at how friendly the American border guards at the Vancouver airport were. The guy, it was in the morning, and he was so friendly, and he was like so nice to me. He didn't even look at my passport. He didn't ask anything. He just looked at me and said, "Hey, where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to visit my kid." He says, "Great, have a great time. How was your weekend?" I was like, "All right, thanks." And in the same breath, I'm getting calls now. I just got off a call before this with one of my long-term colleagues, who's Somali. She moved to Vancouver as a refugee when she was a young kid. And she had planned a trip to New York City to celebrate her graduation from Simon Fraser in May. And she was just asking, like, should that trip, should I change my ticket? Doesn't make any sense to go to New York, Matt. And that's obviously a super tricky question for me. But that question may be taken out of her hands pretty soon, because it looks like a Muslim ban may well be reenacted. There's lots of talk about an outright ban of people who are born in certain countries who carry certain passports being banned straight up from the United States, and many other countries being put on a watch list. And you can be sure that a black hijabi woman who was born in a refugee camp in Somalia is not going to get the same treatment at the border that I did, and that there will be a whole raft of other questions They may well be there. They may well be tracking her over time. She may well be refused. And by the time May comes around, I would not be surprised at all if the question of whether or not she should go to New York will be taken out of our hands. And those are questions that we need to think about in the most everyday sense. Um, I wasn't sure how to answer. Obviously, I'm a middle-aged white dude. So to answer, one of my closer pals who's a young woman about crossing a border, I can only guess. And I can't really offer advice except to say that right now, right here in New York, it's a bonkers time. Friends of my kid were just deported and just um, for being part of a Palestinian protest here in New York City, and was just incarcerated in New York City, even though he had an 8-month-old as a legal resident of the United States has, and his wife is 8 months pregnant. He was incarcerated in New York City and was immediately sent to Louisiana, where he's now languishing in a jail in Louisiana with almost an entire suspension of habeas corpus. It's a really complicated time in lots of ways. And I think, well, the questions that we're trying to raise are very immediate and very personally political, i.e., yeah, should you be, what do you think about your trip to the United States? What do you think about, who are you going to vote for in a coming election? What do you like? What should responses be to, for example, TIFs? Those are very immediate and everyday questions that you are surely having with your friends and your family and your colleagues. But they're also, I think, really theoretical questions. And so when we ask a question about community, there's a pivot point in there we've been talking quite a bit about, this idea of essentialness and inessentiality. And it takes a minute to kind of wrap your head around. But the question is really who can you be in common with? What are the characteristics of people that you can be in common with? And we're facing a time now where there is intense interest in ever thickening borders, of creating borders that are dense, heavily carceral, militarized in increasingly and accelerating ways. And is that the kind of world that we want to live in? There are certain kinds of borderlessness being evoked, but other kinds of intense bordering. And with bordering always comes exceptionally intense border violence. And so the question is like, when you conceive of the world that you're interested in being part of, what are you thinking about borders? And I might suggest to you that that's an intensely theoretical question as well. And I hope that there's an interplay in this book, and you can see Am and I and our friends grappling with that idea and thinking about the idea of friendship as a way to think past that, think past all that fixity and all that stuckness. And I don't know about you, but certainly I get what are you going to do? How can we think about this? They just seem so caught and so dead-ended. And that when even the response to this virulent rise in ethno-nationalism is an intensification of borders. I don't know if you ever look at that website or that Instagram page, the Walking Eagle. And they had a great headline today about how settlers complaining about other settlers wanting to take stolen land from them. And how that notion and how those notions are all bound up with one another about what regard does the intense Canadian response to American antagonisms, to what regard does that deepen colonial dispossessions of stolen Indigenous territory? So again, I just want to keep putting that out there for you, and to keep thinking about how we can think simultaneously. We can think theoretically, and we can think in the very here and now. And we can think descriptively, that is what's going on, and we can think prescriptively, what should be going on at the same time. And that those questions, hopefully, that our books evince that kind of grappling that Am and I have been up to with ourselves and with each other and with our pals. And to it's not necessarily to valorize confusion, but to say, hey, these are questions of which there are no particular easy answers, and that we ourselves are not particularly sure of how to move forward. And to think of that not as loss, but as a possibility. Joel, why don't you give it a couple more minutes, and then why don't we let?
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of things around borders and borderlessness and how we might think about nationalisms and discourses. Back in 2003-04, I worked with a Palestinian NGO within Israel. So Palestinian citizens of Israel working on the citizenship law. If a Palestinian married somebody from the West Bank or Gaza, they couldn't become a citizen, they couldn't locate, and so it violated aspects of international human rights law. And that was the time period at which the wall was being built along the West Bank, and sort of saw the deployment of that type of border politics built around security and how it was propagandized into a political context where the politicians who were pushing it at that time, Ariel Sharon, Netanyahu, was out of power, but definitely pushing for those aspects of how the physical reality can be used politically. So when you see it being talked about in Hungary or the US-Mexico border, there's a material kind of political advantage oftentimes for people who are pushing those hard policies, attempting to break open contradictions of a more progressive orientation around that. On the other hand, this sort of privilege of a Canadian passport, kind of what that gets you as an outsider. When I went back in 2006, I landed a couple of days before the Israel-Hezbollah war in 2006. I could, with a Canadian passport, start my day in Jerusalem, be in Mia Sharim, Orthodox Jewish neighborhood. I could take the bus to Ramallah during the afternoon, go have lunch there, meet with friends, come back that same evening, have lunch with my Israeli friends in the basement of the Jerusalem Theater, and spend my evening listening to Arabic music in East Jerusalem in a way that people who lived there couldn't move in the same way. And so there are all these kind of contradictions as well of what the outsider or the stranger or this aspect has the right to move freely in a way that people's that are living there have an ordered existence through checkpoints and other aspects. And certainly for Palestinians, the wall is a very real thing, breaking up communities in very different in the way that settlers are moving in and out towards settlements. And so this type of blueprint, which is becoming increasingly common, which has been tried out in different places, I think is the worry that you could seemingly have nation states where you get to vote, you have a judiciary, you have all of these kind of liberal gestures as part of it, but also we have a highly ordered, highly carceral state where the freedom of movement is highly regimented, is highly surveyed, and is increasingly attempting to be normalized as part of the practice of everyday life. And because of the technological apparatus, our own cell phones to other aspects of the way that we can be monitored from afar, this becomes even deeper. And certainly the type of digital regime placed amongst the Uyghur community in China is an extreme example of that. But certainly we are going to be seeing increasing attempts at this. And so as we try to think through a different way of being in the world, a different way of attempting solidarities that are borderless, how can we imagine a different type of conception, and what can solidarity look like beyond the ways that we've imagined it so far? Because certainly just in a day-to-day human sense, we need that, but also in terms of the ecological emergency, if we're going to think about democracy, can we think about a democracy to come that includes the more than human? And what might that open up in terms of theoretical, philosophical, and really practical interventions?
Wait, you want to stop there and see what we can do? Ruth, you got an opinion on that?
Yeah, why don't we so you had some questions for us, but why don't we ask some questions for you, and then maybe we can gather around together around the some of the ways that you've inflected the how to be together question. And maybe just to sort of locate us where we are, I'll start with a question just about how you you started off by locating yourselves at the margins of the university. And I wondered if you are able to reflect with us a little bit about how the kinds of possibilities that you glimpse or the failures you see on university campuses as sites for gathering. And where just to extend some of your vivid reflections, Matt, on what it's like to be in New York right now. Just what we're witnessing so harrowingly is the way that autocracies mobilize state power by immediately making their forces felt on places of institutions of deliberation where we gather to grapple with our mutual obligations to one another. And on the other hand, universities are places, as we've seen, where state that can be direct extensions of state enforcement disappearing, having a hand in disappearing Mahmoud Khalil from university housing. And so wanting to be very careful of thinking about the classroom or campus as any kind of safe refuge. But yeah, we're sort of, that's been one of the guiding questions for SASAH, but also in this classroom, is just what can be accomplished in classrooms that can't be accomplished anywhere else in terms of exploring and testing out and experimenting with socialities and solidarities, forging the kinds of friendships that might extend off campus, and what are the kinds of constraints or limits or ways that those ways of being together are surveyed or made to conform to socialities that actually reinforce the logic of borders or nationalism that we are trying to imagine our way past.
That's a complicated question. That's a good question. Can I actually just turn it on you for half a second? What are some of the things you guys have thought about? Anybody got an answer for this? Like, what does it feel like to be a university student now?
Seeing a few like eye rolls, saw a couple of eye rolls, some looking away.
Some,
You're on social media, right? So maybe you're seeing some events. The same location.
Except you're being recorded.
yeah, right.
I can jump in with a couple of thoughts as people are thinking about questions. But we've seen in the Canadian context not that long ago, the students in Montreal shutting down the city with increases in tuition rates for international students and others. We see what's happening in Belgrade today, which really came out of the universities, particularly the student movement, in terms of calling out the contradictions and the corruption of government. On the other hand, as you said, there's very real kind of aspects where, because universities have been seen as sites of resistance, you see an incredible amount of state repression. We saw it happen in Turkey, where professors were expunged from the universities. University students were taken out, but university students were also utilized as a means of the surveillance. India, very similar circumstances at universities there. In the US, with the kind of right-wing surveillance on campuses, you're seeing real-time uploading of lectures and things onto sites that are meant to attack and criticize people. And so you definitely see all of that happening. I've got friends in the US where their equity, diversity, inclusion departments are entirely being shut down, departments called ethnic studies being shut down. and full-scale challenging of endowments, taxing of endowments. We've seen this in other countries as well. So the economic model is that coercion that government has in terms of its relationship to universities is being utilized in a very frontal attack on universities. And I think just because we haven't seen the same things happen in Canada, that blueprint could very well be unrolled here as it relates to luckily most of funding for universities are regulated at the provincial level, but at the federal government level is where research funding happens. And those guidelines can be, in as much as they're arm's length, because of the federal government funding going into them, there are ways in which governments could change that criteria in a way that's ideologically oriented. So we're not that safe from the same things happening in the Canadian context, and certainly we've seen examples of that in Alberta, partially in Ontario from time to time, and certainly this federal election I think is going to be an important part in terms of what the outcomes are going to be there, as to see the extent to which we see that movement come into the Canadian context. These sites of deliberation, as you mentioned, become closed off. And so where do we find those places where we can speak with one another, we can imagine and dream up a different form of sociality, different forms of solidarity? And if the university is this site of contestation where we're seeing greater and greater enclosures, then where are we going to create those spaces where those real conversations can happen? Otherwise, we're just simply going to be functioning on a kind of politics on the defensive, which has a limited scope in terms of the way that we can mobilize people in a way that we can energize and sustain social and political movements.
Yeah, maybe I just speak a little bit to this, and then I got a question for you. Maybe I'll try another question, see if this one's a better one, which is, and like Am says, it's these things creep in on us, right? The way that we think about universities, or the way that we think about public spaces, or the way we think about our capacity. Of course, everybody who's a university student is navigating, a particular time in your lives when you're thinking through ideas together with folks, and potentially like in a time where you have more time to read and write and talk than you might ever again in your lives. And it's a particular time for, exploration and thinking through new ideas. But it's also, of course, a time of trying to navigate your careers. Of also, for many of you, and certainly for me, navigating intense debt, and lots of really very practical everyday questions. I want to reference for you, and if you get a chance to think about Achille Mbembe, I would recommend him. Emma will I'll put his name in the Q&A here for you. But I would say that one of I'm going to paraphrase him probably badly here, but he talks about borders, but also it's really involved with the freedom to move. To say and I'm going to again poorly quote Hannah Arendt here. He says that thinking through movement is at the heart of all things political. And Mbembe says that denying people the capacity to move based on the accident of their birth is a last desperate attempt to try to concretize and maintain unearned racial privilege. And that the capacity of people to move is essential to thinking past borders, but thinking about what that movement looks like and who can move under what auspices and when. And that who deserves to be where, under what premises. And that notion of both of movement and who deserves to be where, and then again is to harken back to that question of who can we be in common with, who can we be in community with. And in a very basic sense is like, well, who should be allowed to live in London, Ontario? And why should some people justify their presences there and their capacity to live a life primarily based around freedom there, and other people are denied that? Under what basis? and to try to think through those kinds of relationships about who can we be in common with, we evoke this idea of friendship. Not, I hope, in the, oh, can't we just all hold hands and be friends uh, way, not in that kind of hallmarky, saccharine way, but in a way of thinking through the notion of friendship, which is a relationship that Julieta Singh says are the relationships for which we have no other name. That they're not bound by particular family structures. They're not bound by particular constraints. In fact, friendships are very porous. There's a permeability to friendships that are always they're always up for negotiation. And that the question then is to think through what would a borderless world look like? And then we begin to think, well, what about the notion of friendship as a theoretical idea? But even more than that, what about the idea of friendship as a political idea? Not in the, oh, can we be friends with people who are not like us? But in a way of like, what are the qualities of our friendships and our thinking about friendships that might think about other relationships beyond, say, citizenship? So maybe it's a question, maybe Em, you can pick it up, and then maybe other folks, maybe if you can have an answer, is like, what did you think about our deployment of the idea of friendship? What came to your mind? Did you think it had anything to it? Do you think it had something beyond just kind of like its normal deployment as like its normal deployment as an individualized kind of niceness? Is there a way to think through friendship as a collective or as a political ideal? Joel, pick that up and maybe some
Yeah,
other
I'll just add a bit. Yeah, well, we have a chapter on gentleness in the book where we're thinking through the work of a French philosopher who sadly passed away a number of years ago, Anne Dufour-Montel. She has a really beautiful book called on gentleness that I'd highly recommend. But I think maybe picking off of Matt's point, I'm just going to read one of Mbembe's quotes that's in the last chapter, and maybe just read a little bit that's sort of driving at what Matt was talking about. So this is a quote from Mbembe in the first part. The Earth's specificity lies in that it makes room for all its inhabitants with no distinction of race or species. It mocks both the blind particular and the bare singularity. It reminds us of how each body, human or otherwise, however singular, bears on it and within it, in its essential porosity, not the marks of the universal, but traces of the in common. As a result, every politics of the living rests by definition on the idea that the living is that which is priceless. And because it is priceless, it is fundamentally beyond measure. As such, it can neither be counted nor weighed. It belongs simply to the incalculable. The idea that without strong borders you cannot have a strong nation is precisely the closure that has to be challenged in order to consider a new way of being in the world. Through this porosity, we rediscover the essence of politics and its reinvigoration. As Mbembe argues, to overcome the architecture of violence that functions on a planetary scale, there is a call to be attuned to the constitutive fragility of the critical zones of life and their places of encounter and entanglement that form the basis of a possible resistance amongst different forms of life. It is through the assembling of practices by which living beings and the more than human cohabitate with friendship and hazard the tenuous formation of communities. The return to mutuality, transformative solidarity, the recognition of our planetary vulnerability beyond the limits of its reactionary human identities is a call to collectively reinvigorate our existence in the time that remains, to build proximity to a seemingly impossible justice. The organizing of a series of ruptures towards a new life is to think around the inherited order and open the door to the potency and poetry of new thresholds through visible and invisible solidarities where the creative mutations of politics can form promiscuous alliances that surpass contemporary thresholds and modes of the possible. So I'll leave it at that for now. Matt, I wonder if we should get to the questions that you posed at the beginning there.
Yeah, maybe. Does anybody in the class or online? I noticed there's some good online, couple of good online questions. But I'm wondering if anybody in the classroom or can speak to what anything came to your mind or what thoughts you've had about our deployment of the idea of friendship. there anything that caught anybody's attention? Is there anything that you think that might have some value?
Amy, you're a good test for how our mic pickup is.
I could speak to it. I think I found it an interesting concept in that it definitely challenged me, especially when it was brought to the ideas of of being friends with more than human. Like, I think that was something that took a while of sitting with just to begin to understand and like realize, I guess, to put it in similar terms, the borders within my own mind of what I had decided would be possible with a word as charged as friendship. So I think I found it a challenging and new concept more than just what it's defined as in kindergarten per se. So
And where'd you end up with?
I guess it's a continuing process of what I ended up with, but I definitely ended up with um a little bit, I guess, more of an openness and an exploratory, is that a word? I don't know. Kind of looking at options of what that may look like with animals. I guess I ended up with my own biases and my own um borders per se.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like that's a question that kept coming up for folks, and it kind of ends up being kind of down a it ends up confusing to me. It's we were sitting with one of our buddies up at a cabin, uh, and he said, you know, well, do you think you could be friends with a tree? And he was like, his family had owned this cabin forever, and he was like, I think that I am friends with that tree. Um, I feel like I've had a relationship. I grew up, you know, he's our age or whatever, so he's been around that tree for generations. He feels like I feel like I have a friendship with that tree. I think, and I was, you know, we were laughing about it, but we were like, well, how would you know? How would you know? And then it kind of tweaked that question of requitedness. Do you think? And there's a question about, you know, hear that phrase like unrequited love. But I'm not actually 100% certain about this, but I think it would be impossible to have an unrequited friendship. That's real weird. That's a weird idea to think, oh, I'm friends with her, but she doesn't know who I am. And I think that implies some kind of agreement or some kind of consent. And I'm not sure what that would look like. I think that, you know, I feel like I've had friendships with other than humans, but I'm not sure why I think that, or if that's just me imagining or me anthropocentrizing like overly. I don't know what's going on there exactly. But I often think too about like the one of the things about friendship is that it's always contingent. That is, you always constantly have to prove yourself because it can end at any time. Sometimes your friendships end for good reasons. Sometimes they end for reasons that are regrettable, and sometimes they end and you don't even know it. Sometimes they just kind of go away. Um, and I think there's something about that that's important because no matter how much, like with familiar relationships, um, you know, those will always, you can't get rid of them. You can maybe, you know, you can refuse to be like in a relationship with them. You refuse to see them, but that person will always be your father or will always be your cousin. There's nothing that can be done about that. But friendships can and do disappear. And that means that both ends of that, there has to be a consensual relationship, but you also have to constantly make and remake them over time. And to maintain friendships over, say, decades or even years means you have to be always changing because the person you were and the person your friend is was not the same person. And so you're constantly having to think through what it means to be treating that person right. Because otherwise that thing could just go away. And I got interested, you know, Em and I were interested in that, not like in part, I guess, because Em and I have been friends for a long time, but also about that requitedness and about that mutuality and about that consent. And I often sit and I wonder, like I said, I think I said earlier that I live on a houseboat. And sometimes I sit and I watch the Fraser River go by. And it's like, it's an insanely huge river. I can't remember the number. I should know this number now, but it's something like 6 billion liters a day flow down it. It's like it's this unbelievable flushing mechanism. And yet, I don't think I would swim in that river. Even out by the mouth, it's kind of filthy and kind of polluted. And if I was in it, I'm pretty sure I'd have a shower right after. And one of the things that kept coming to my mind as I watch it is like, that's a shitty way to treat a friend. That's just a lousy way to treat somebody. Um, I don't know what that means, and I don't think that river cares for me at all. But but I wonder about that. I wonder about that relationship, and I wonder whether or not you could be friends with, say, a river, or is that just kind of like that just you imagining stuff?
You had, Rowan, you had your hand up, and did you, Sammy? Or
I kind of like Boston, but I was just gonna say like the way.
can you hear?
Yep.
Make a signal.
Well, I kind of forget what I was going to say originally, but like in reading about like the friendship in the reading, like I was looking at it more as like somewhat of like a base level respect and like a willingness to connect and like a willingness to be friends with, you know, everybody. Like obviously we're not going to be friends with everybody, but or like everything. Um, but like that like kind of friendship, it was like, you know, the idea that, you know, you can like somebody or you cannot like somebody, but you still have to love them and like that sort of thing. It just felt a lot more like general than like, I don't know, like more like I can offer my friendship to somebody. Who cares if they accept it or not? They still have my friendship, like that sort of thing.
That kind of echoes Rebecca Eckhart in the Q&A says, is friendship the best goal with non-human peoples? Honestly, why not respect? My gut says trees would be content with that. Offering our friendship feels a bit arrogant.
I kind of wanted to continue off Matt's point where that where I understood when I did the reading that friendships do feel a lot more fragile than our relationships with family in the sense that they're always constantly we have to kind of prove one another to still have that level of trust and friendship. And as I read it, I thought of it as it being one of the most exposing and raw kind of relationships that you have to form and put this insane amount of trust in another individual, and almost in a way to secure a form of connection and to have that deep love for another individual that's outside of your family or outside of yourself. And I think individuals don't really give enough credit for the kind of love that we give into another person, because I think it's a very interesting concept that we'll meet a stranger and then next thing you know, if you have that connection, they know every intimate secret about you, everything that you know, you kind of are as an individual and they're not your family member. So I thought of friendship being more than just this relationship with this kind of transitory state of having this like connection and this understanding of one another, and whether or not if politics can destroy that.
Mm.
And I had that perspective of thinking that I personally cannot be friends with someone that was a pure Trump supporter at heart, because I know that I wouldn't be able to have that transitory connection. But if some people can look beyond the differences and find what really connects them as human beings at the end of the day, I thought that was a really you know, profound thought of friendship.
I'll just thank you for that comment. You know, one of the things as we were working on the book, we read Jody Dean's book, Comrade, and we were trying to think through what's the difference between a comrade and a friend, because some of the characteristics are very similar. Do you have this person's back? Are you going to be there for them? That type of thing. And in comrade, that's built around a kind of political solidarity. And friendship has a political solidarity in a small p kind of sense, but we probably have all sorts of people in our lives that we care about, that we're there for, that we don't necessarily share a full politics with. It has to do with spending time together, other experience. Maybe you went to elementary school with them, you know, played sports together or whatever it was, and you still have an empathy and a kindness and a connection that you'll be there for that person. That is something past a political solidarity. And so what does that look like, and what is that distinction? Because there's definitely an overlap of where that happens. And as Matt said, with family, we inherit that relationship. And so it's very different. It's not chosen. But that distinction is an important one. I do, having grown up in a very white working class town, I have people who I would consider friends who I don't share our politics with, but that has to do with other things beyond politics, and that's sometimes very difficult to navigate because there's by its premise there's going to be frictions in place as a part of that relationship. And to Rebecca's comment around, I think that's a really good point that you make. Is that can we simply show respect rather than friendship? And I think there are ways in which friendship, when it's in a distorted context, it can feel like a kind of charitable thing being placed on it. And we're trying to, I think, in the book, disrupt that notion of friendship as a different type of relation. So I think a lot of what we're trying to say is similar to what you're saying in the way that you're talking about respect. Matt, do you want to jump in on some of the other questions online?
Could I just enter into the mix? Just Tanner and I have been sort of grappling with the title of the book for a while, and sort of trying to trace the like one of the reasons why you might like friendship feels like a worthwhile sort of container or word to congregate around is just because of its long history, that to talk about friendship is to talk about philosophy. And but there is a way that it feels like the phrase we could interpret it in many ways. Oh, my friend, there is no friend, would seem that, a kind of negation of the relationship potentially. And we are sort of grappling with like the singularity of friendship versus if there's multiple friends, maybe that there's a tension between the multiplicity or the plurality. But I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about choosing to frame your investigation of friendship with that phrase. And just one thing, as we were sort of trying to grapple with it, we encountered was Derrida citing Nietzsche saying friendship is more loving than love, insofar as it's more rare in many ways. How Derrida talks about it is in ways that you talked about it, Xavier, just the kind of the risk and exposure and the unknowability and the kind of contingency, the lack of guarantees. But yeah, I just would love to hear just as one other angle into how we might think about friendship, your reflections on the title.
Yeah, have a shot at it.
Sure,
Okay.
sure. Well, just before I jump into to answer that, I wanted to recommend another book on friendship, on Nietzsche and friendship, which is done by a friend of ours, Willow Verkerk, Verkerk, and she does a feminist reading of Nietzsche and goes into that work. And she's based in Vancouver, so we were in conversation with her as we were working on this book. That quote, "Oh, my friend, there is no friend," it gets misattributed to Aristotle. It was used by somebody named Diogenes. It got picked up by Derrida. It got quoted and misquoted in various ways in terms of its meaning. In terms of the way it was originally written, what people have argued is it means something like he or one who has many friends has no friend is one of its meanings in the way it was originally used. But in the way that it was misquoted and taken up and re-referenced by other philosophers and thinkers into the present, it took on different meanings and forms. And quite honestly, in terms of how we came up with the book, is that we didn't necessarily want to use the word community in the way that the books in operative community and unavailable community had been done in other places, and we had to put in a title as a container, and so we decided to put this out there because it had a relationship to classical work that went back to the Greeks, to the present age. And so I think it's befuddling for some people, which might explain our low sales for this book. But it does have a relationship to the literature and the work around friendship historically.
Yeah, and I think it's also too, like, I think that kind of confusion around it, like, what does it mean that even folks who like, the folks who like, I mean, it's even been misattributed for years and years, and it's kind of malleability speaks in a lot of respect to, I think, the notion of friendship that we are trying to evoke here. This idea of something that we're not sure about, that we're not sure about exactly how it might be valuable to us, exactly how it might be valuable to thinking through these seemingly intractable and foreclosed questions. At a time when things seem so desperate in so many ways, and that there seems to be so few alternatives, um, and alternatives that are being posed uh, seem so poor in so many ways, and so and stricken with so much poverty, that the idea of that kind of malleability or that porosity or that unsureness, the plasticity of that word of friendship, and that the title evokes that in some ways. Like, I don't know, what's it meaning? And it begins to open that up in some ways. Um, and in lots of ways too, I think this is a point that I think we made in the book, but trying to make again as well, is this idea that that the contemporary left, in my lifetime for certain, that's for over the course of the 50 years, is marked by a particular backfootedness. When we think about the left and left social movements, it's always resist that, defend this, fight that. Um, they're always on the back foot. The political right, in particular, in an era of 7 8 years of neoliberalism, has had all the intellectual energy to move forward, to think new things, to think about new social formations, to think about new economic relationships. And the left has been perilously incapable of articulating positive social visions. And you see this particularly now, and you can certainly see this in the amongst the in the United States, where I am now, about the failure to articulate something other than what Trump and the MAGA agenda is articulating so clearly. And it may be something that we despise or are dismayed by, but the MAGA vision is clear, and it's easily articulatable. It's easily replicable in small and big visions. It's a vision that many of us, I'm guessing, in the room may loathe. And yet the alternative is what? Not that. And I think it's contingent upon all of us, and certainly among for left movements, and certainly for social movements and ecological movements, to articulate something else. What is that vision of the world that we are fighting for? And I think that's a real challenge, for certainly in many ways. And in many ways, like this book, and well, these two books are modest attempts to try to begin to think through that. What could it look like differently? If we are saying that these kind of hyper-militarized, hyper-carceral borders that are in their very nature racist and xenophobic, then what else are we asking for? Are we asking for something like open borders? And what would that mean? What would an actual freedom of movement look like, and what would it need? What is that? What are we calling for here? And I do not think that those questions need to be finished. They don't need to be fixed in place. But we need to be able to think through, yes, philosophical and theoretical ideas, but more than that, political programs and social organizations and movements that can speak to people in an everyday sense, in an everyday way of being in the world. What is a different way of being in the world other than what we have now, which appears to be both an ecological straight run into a brick wall, and or a political vision that is increasingly like dismaying and violent. And I think part of that is to say, well, what space does thinking about friendship open up to think about new relationships and be together with people, to be together with the other than human world? And so if that, Ruth, that title feels unfixed, and it feels unclear, and I'm not sure, I think that actually in some ways is a virtue. Um, and maybe not. It may also be just that we needed a title, but it also may be that that it presents a kind of unclarity to it that I don't think we should run from.
I'll just add a couple of things. You know, one of the people that we spoke with in the book, Julietta Singh from the University of Richmond, she's a high school dropout from Winnipeg, really wonderful person. But one of the things she said as we spoke to her is friendship is the name we have for something that has no other name. And we found that a bit hard to kind of deal with. It was Leela Gandhi said something similar, and trying to get our heads around what that meant, because we were constantly trying to find a definition of friendship. And as we spoke more and more to people, we were finding it harder and harder. People were gesturing towards certain things about it as this sort of unnameable entity that's constantly shifting and changing. And so to some degree, the title evokes that. The other point I wanted to make was, I think, this broader one around, what does theory in philosophy have to do with social change? In the middle of these deep acceleration of crises, things are right in our face in terms of what's happening. Artificial intelligence, the acceleration of these political closures all around us. There's a quote from Alain Badiou that he uses in one of his works, which is, theory in philosophy is like that attic up in the room where you go and take the space and time to carve your knives, to go out and to do battle back into the world. It's a metaphor, of course, but if we're simply responding to the world as it is with these closures, we're simply going to become exhausted and fall over and have very little potency to the movements or resistances we're trying to form as a part of our existence and living and being in the world. And so I think it's important to carve out the time and space to think through what's happening so that we can act out in a better way, that whether it functions at the scale of the problem or allows us to experiment in different ways, it's really important. There's a great book by a philosopher named Byung-Chul Han, a Korean philosopher based in Germany, a book called Vita Contemplativa, and he makes the case for stillness and contemplation. And you could do a reading of it where it may seem, narcissistic or inward, or a book about wellness or inactivity. But to me, it's a very political book, because he's essentially making that argument about the relationship between thought, philosophy, theory, contemplation, and action, that this precedes what happens afterwards. And so I think in the way that Matt and I are involved in social and political movements, doing work on the ground, it's in this place of reading, contemplation, theory, philosophy, that we can experiment with what we're seeing on the ground, with what we're grappling with, and which is the reason why the books don't end up with a political program, because we're still perplexed with these questions. This is part of our dead ends and orientations and things that we keep coming back to. We wanted to democratize our disorientation by sharing this work.
Maybe, yeah, we have just somehow 3 minutes. And I wonder, it seems right to have a question as a place to end from the room.
Can I ask you a question back to everybody here?
Yeah.
I want to ask a question about, there's a question in here from Ara about the spaces where conversations can happen and also be safe from various forms of violence. And I suspect that's a question that you're talking about quite often in your everyday lives. There to think about that. And I want to just kind of harken back to one of your original questions, Ruth, about the place of a university and how you guys are feeling now. And how yeah, I guess that's a question. Just about how you're feeling about that, about pursuing those kinds of questions in a way that feels like both creative and open, but also safe. That'd be a question maybe for profs in the room, but maybe even more so for students too, about how to feel it, about how to approach those questions.
I just kind of wanted to, like, in my personal opinion, I think that no matter what kind of where you're having a conversation or who you're having it with, I always think that there's going to be some level of risk and some level of like indirect violence, whether if it's not from the people you're having a conversation with or the environment you're particularly in. I think there's always going to be this kind of outside force that is going to affect the conversations that you are having. And I think that's something that's unavoidable in conversation, but I also think it's something that needs to be addressed because even if everyone in the conversation is on board, shares similar ideas, I think that it's very important to address the very real violence that other individuals face because well we're very fortunate that we can be in a classroom setting here where we respect one another's opinions and we can openly share how we feel about the state of the political world right now and how we personally feel affected by a lot of these environmental policies that are going to show drastic effects to the world in years to come. And I think we need to really honor the idea that we can have these environments safely, but there is a form of risk and violence because we never know if, for example, this recording gets out and someone sees it and they have very negative opinions on the Palestinian liberation, and that poses a form of a risk and violence towards us if our university had that kind of aspect saying, oh, if you protest for Palestinian rights, then you're at risk for losing your degree. Thankfully, we don't have these kind of consequences, but we have to recognize that these things do exist and it poses active violence. So it's more of the matter of is there ever truly a safe space to have these conversations? Are we ever truly 100% free from conflict?
Up from here. Hi. Okay. I'll try and speak up, but I honestly, in thinking about the question, I think that we're still figuring that out ourselves. As Xavier was saying, our classroom we have a lot of shared perspective, but obviously each individual comes with their own unique perspective. But oftentimes in our classroom, I don't think our discussion always reflects our differing perspective. We oftentimes agree with one another, but it's very rare that we have someone kind of call out an opinion that's extremely different. And so I think in the question, answering the question, like finding like a safe space, I think we're still figuring that out because I think a lot of us are pretty reserved when sharing our observations, not necessarily because we're fearful of a, like Xavier said, a direct form of violence, but maybe because we're worried about some implicit forms of violence that we all, yeah, are kind of fearful about. So I think we're still figuring out how we can make this a safe space that invites opinions that are maybe not ones that we all share.
Yeah, and I think that's a good question to think about. It's a very kind of an insightful answer in lots of ways because, to think about difference is not just to think about, folks who might have lighter or darker skin tone than you, or maybe like have different eating habits, but to think about through how to be in common and how to be in community with folks who may hold opinions that you love, that you find like super problematic, questions of belief and questions of practice that are like really foreign to you and that you may not understand or even be able to find traction with. Those are questions that I think are like particularly interesting, and that you kind of gesture towards.
Yeah, and I'll just say, maybe by way of thank you, by way of thanks, that just a lot of the way your own experimentation around friendship and asking us to examine just what kinds of friendships allow us to imagine to act together towards building the kinds of futures we want to live towards. you're talking to students who are kind of in a rare position. Actually, a lot of the SASAH students are going to spend, you're finding them in their first year of the next 4 years. And so there is a way that there's one version of classroom community that, you know, is a kind of 12-week affair. And there's something actually sort of powerful about that kind of contingency. But also, I'm just grateful for you offering this particular group just some challenging but incredibly generatively so over the last couple of weeks. And I imagine for going forward to the end of the term, but also for the next 4 years, ways to think about how to inhabit the kinds of relationships that are, as Sammy so movingly put it, you're just testing them out together. And that testing process has a long horizon. And we're grateful for the tools and models that you have offered us for that long game.
Yeah, Ruth, just wanted to say thank you to all of you. I'm going through a very disorienting time right now, having lost my job and my parents being sick and being up here. But I find it orienting and very grounding to be in conversation around these questions with all of you, and hope that you continue to think them through and new ones as well. I'll pass it over to Matt.
That's sweet. I'd just say thanks so much for spending time today. Wish we were there, but this is just appreciate your time and thinking through some kind of complicated and some hopefully both simultaneously disorienting and generative ideas. So thank you very much, folks, for inviting us.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate y'all.